Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to the Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, this is Jay Shapiro. Thanks for listening. Most of the program today is devoted to the agreement between the United Arab Emirates and Israel, which is a major historical breakthrough. However, I will devote a portion of the program to the unrest in the United States. The rioting and disorder in the United States is extremely disturbing. The 20th century was the American century, and now the thin layer of civilization and society seems to be falling apart. When I grew up, the Democrats and Republicans were either a little bit left of center or a little bit right of center. And now the Democrats have become a socialist party, which bodes no good for the United States and for the world. Meanwhile, the U.S. president has essentially been involved in making an agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. They formalized a bond between Israel and the UAE. The technology of Israel combined with the economic powerhouse of the UAE can really be something. Both countries are at the forefront of success in a changing global world. Dubai has become a very important financial center. It's a place of tolerance, and not just relative to the rest of the Arab world. Its population is vibrant and diverse. It has become a home to American universities and a hub for key airlines. Israel's innovation has impressed the world and become a model, especially for other small countries. Its accomplishments have come despite having very few natural resources and a turbulent political system. After peace agreements with Egypt and then Jordan failed to result in increased ties between Israel and the other Arab countries, this agreement creates opportunities for cooperation in all kinds of fields like agriculture, tourism, technology, which is really needed today. It would be very symbolic if the lifting of the animosity between these two countries leads to a breakthrough the world has been waiting for. I'll say more about this in the upcoming segments of the program. Thanks again for listening.
Always challenging the status quo. Hello, I'm Rod Bryant on Beyond the Matrix here at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. I want to encourage you to listen each week, every Wednesday at the same time, for an amazing show that will challenge you, inform you, and inspire. News, views, and wisdom for the nations here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Don't forget, Beyond the Matrix every week, Wednesday, here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
You're listening to the Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. As I said in the introduction, the big news is the new relationship between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. However, as I said, there's something else that's happening that I must make mention of. And that has to do with what is happening in the United States right now. By any conventional political standard, the Democratic Convention, which is going on this week, the Democrats are sacrificing something by holding their convention virtually. There won't be television shots of energetic crowds chanting the candidates' names. There won't be an opportunity for Biden and his running mate to test which issues and applause lines get the people out of their seats. But there also won't be an opportunity for the voters to take a good, hard look at the violence and unrest gripping many American cities. In any other year, Democrats could be rightly upset at the loss of their in-person convention. But right now, they should count themselves lucky to be sitting behind screens. As Biden and Kamala Harris, his choice for vice president, and other prominent members of the Democratic Party speak to voters from their houses this week, they won't be accosted by black bloc radicals convinced that the nomination was once again stolen from Senator Bernie Sanders. They won't have to confront the increasingly violent minority who believe the entire Democratic Party should be burned down along with the rest of America's institutions. There'll be no opportunity for the rioting that shook Chicago during the 1968 convention and may have, at least in part, led to Nixon's election. I remember the 1968 convention. That's when they nominated Hubert Humphrey, and it really was a mess. Things had happened at that convention, on the streets outside the convention, that had become daily fare today. But back in 1968, they were unusual. So the office seekers are not just avoiding the kind of nominally political rioting that's wrecked downtown Portland and Chicago in recent weeks. They're also avoiding the surge in indiscriminate violent crime that has swept through the nation's great cities, most of whom have Democratic administrations. In Milwaukee, the site of this week's convention, if you can call it a convention site, homicides were up 85% over last year, and non-fatal shootings were up 64% as of last month. And now Biden and Harris don't have to step foot in the city, and neither the elite Washington and New York-based reporters and pundits, some of whom may have become curious about the goings-on just a few blocks away from the Miller High Life Theater in downtown Milwaukee. The surge in violence continued right along across America's major cities over the last weekend. In New York City, 49 people were shot in a period of 72 hours beginning Thursday, more than 8 times as many as were shot over the same period last year. An off-duty corrections officer who was shot with his own service weapon after leaving a party in Queens was among the 7 people killed. There have been 1,087 shooting victims across 888 different incidents in New York, just New York, so far this year, compared to 577 victims across 457 shootings at this point last year. 18 people were shot in 4 separate incidents in Cincinnati over the weekend, and in Chicago, where shootings are up 54% this year, 64 people were shot, 5 fatally. Unless some concerned citizens are hiding in their closets, the Democrats won't be asked to discuss these numbers as they address the American people this week from the comfort and safety of their homes. This is what is happening in the United States, and it is frightening. And it's not the United States I remember when I was a kid, or when I was an adult for that matter. The surge in violence that has emerged this summer in major American cities continued over the weekend. And as I said, at least 64 shooting victims in Chicago and 52 in New York City since Thursday. So the President Trump on Sunday threatened to lead a federal response to violence in New York. And the violence is absolutely unbelievable. So the administrations of these cities, all of whom are Democratic, really have something to answer. And you don't hear anything being said about it. So I just wanted to bring this up because it is so shocking to me. I came on Aliyah more than 50 years ago, and of course, over the years, I've had occasion to go back to the States many times, but I don't think I would recognize it anymore. And I just had to get that off my chest. Now, what I want to do is talk about what's happening here in Israel. There's been a peace agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. The breakthrough was apparently brokered by the United States and should not be seen as just another Arab country joining the circle of those who have already recognized Israel. Without belittling the huge importance of peace with Egypt and Jordan, those agreements were focused on ending hostilities between Israel and neighbors that had gone to war against each other in numerous times over the previous half century. These landmark achievements have proven effective in maintaining peace and stability all these years. Note that Israel has not had to deal with a major conflict with Egypt or Jordan in the last 40 years, even as it continues to fight bitter battles on its northern front and against the terrorists in Gaza, which geographically is an hour's drive from Tel Aviv. I should add, traffic permitting. All this comes in the shadow of an existential threat coming from Iran, which openly proclaims its desire to achieve a nuclear capability and to wipe the Jewish state off the face of the earth. The real meaning of peaceful relations with the United Arab Emirates is the promise of Israel's acceptance, not only by the first of many modern Arab states, but among the forward-thinking leaders of this region who recognize Israel's strategic importance to those who also face the Shiite dreams, the Shiite being Iran, that threaten them as well. Most of the countries around us are Sunni Muslims. The Iran is Shiite, and they're not too crazy about each other. The Iranian threat is not only to Israel, but to the rival nations in the area over which Iran seeks hegemony and seeks to extend its influence in the region, which only begins with their becoming a nuclear power and developing long-range systems that pose a threat to other countries in the area. You have to remember that Israel is only the little Satan, and the United States is the big Satan in the eyes of the Ayatollahs in Iran. Their sought-after nuclear umbrella is simply a way for them to utilize other means, such as terrorism, and the power that their Persian Gulf oil gives them. Ironically, Iran is the perfect antithesis of the United Arab Emirates. By denying human rights and preventing the economic growth of its citizens, the leaders of Iran have repressed their own people, setting back one of the most enlightened cultures of the world and crippling a blossoming middle class and academic intelligentsia. So the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and others face not only an immediate security threat from Iran, but also the danger of its backward ideologies enslaving people's minds. Hence the enormous promise of linking Israel and the UAE, two countries characterized as those intent on making the desert bloom. So the new relationship with the UAE, United Arab Emirates, is really a great change here in the situation in the Middle East. I'll say more about it after the break. To be clear, you have to remember the peace with Egypt and Jordan continues to serve its purpose, yet relations between each of those two countries and Israel have never blossomed beyond a cold peace, never led to realize the potential for growth in the area. I'll say more about this after the break.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Did you know this psalm and many others were composed by a Jewish shepherd and musician who later became a king? Would you like to know some of the inner meanings of psalms to help you connect with God and strengthen your soul? An exciting and easy-to-read book is now available which will help you do just that. Software for the Soul, Psalms for Everyone, available on Kindle, Audible, and Amazon.com. Software for the Soul.
Modesty at the beach? It isn't just about body image. It's about feeling good. Modest swimsuits, so we don't get burned by the sun.
So we won't get ogled by strangers.
So we'll feel free to express ourselves without the need to expose ourselves.
Let Marcy Modest help you to cover up what you want, how you want.
Made in Israel.
Visit marcymodest.com. That's MARSEA modest.com.
And get a 10% discount on your first purchase.
2 new shows on Israel News Talk Radio.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. I want to continue on the subject of the new relationship between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, which I'll refer to as UAE for simplicity. It is a win-win deal for peace. The United Arab Emirates, UAE, will derive many benefits from closer relationships with the Middle East's most stable and advanced country, Israel. These include economic and technological partnerships, military and intelligence sharing, tourism, and better relationships with the United States, and I think much of the rest of the world. The UAE sees the enormous benefit not only to its own people, but to the entire planet, if you really think about it, not simply by calling an end to hostilities, but taking full advantage of Israel's startup nation capability, that's high-tech, water, medicine, and so forth, especially now at a time when the COVID-19 pandemic has reminded the world of the supreme importance of Israel's cutting-edge contributions in the medical field. There's no two ways about it. The deal also demonstrates how quickly changes occur in this volatile part of the globe. It was only a few decades ago when Israel's strongest allies were Iran and Turkey. I remember when I lived in Rehovot, I had an upstairs neighbor who had an import-export business and an office in Tehran, in Iran. For at least 3 or 4 years, he traveled back and forth, but that all stopped in the Iranian Revolution. Our most intractable enemies 50 years ago were Egypt, Jordan, and the Gulf states. Now, you can pretty much say that the verse is true. The other constant problem here in the Middle East, and as far as Israel's concerned, has been the Palestinian leadership. They constantly say no to everything, and this position on the part of the Palestinians goes back to the 1930s when they rejected the so-called Peel Commission recommendation that would have given the Palestinians a state in the vast majority of the British mandate of Palestine. But because it would have given the Jews a tiny, non-contiguous state, the Palestinians at that time said no. They wanted that there be no Jewish state at all, more than they wanted that there be a Palestinian state. So this saying no, this naysaying, continues today with the refusal even to negotiate over the Trump peace plan. The agreement by the UAE to normalize relations with Israel, I think, bodes well for the future of Israel and for the dangerous region in which we live. It was not the first such agreement, as I mentioned previously. There were peace treaties with Egypt in 1979 and with Jordan in 1994. And hopefully it won't be the last. But those agreements with Egypt are true, they are peace, but they are cold peace. It is likely, though, not certain, of course, other Gulf nations may follow. Even the possibility of peace talks with Israel has been mentioned by other leaders. In any event, there's no for sure saying no now. The other Arab countries may normalize relations with Israel. The deal, by the way, means that the Palestinian leadership no longer has a veto on the actions and attitudes of our Arab neighbors, who will do what is in their own best interest without taking into regard what the Palestinians think. The Emirates know that Israel will never allow Iran to develop or acquire nuclear weapons, no matter what it takes to stop them. For the rest of the world, including the United States, a nuclear Iran is more than just a regional diplomatic problem. For Israel, it is an existential threat. For the Gulf states, it may not be an existential threat, but it poses a serious threat to their regimes. So in a sense, you could say that the deal made with the UAE is based on the saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The UAE will derive many benefits from a deal such as it is, and these include technological partnerships, military and intelligence sharing, mutual tourism, and better relations with the United States, which is important to them. By the way, this deal demonstrates how quickly changes occur in this part of the world. As I said a moment ago, there was a time when our worst enemies, our most intractable enemies, were Egypt, Jordan, and the Gulf states. Now the reverse is true. The only constant constructive element in the region is a democratic Israel, which has close ties to the United States, and the United States knows that a stable democratic Israel is good for the United States also. The other, of course, is the Palestinian leadership, which says no to everything. This saying no, this naysaying, continued in 1948, 1967, 2000, and 2008. I think it was Abba Eban who said the Palestinians never miss a chance to take yes for an answer. But the UAE can take yes and does not miss opportunities. The rest of the Arab world should follow. Maybe then the Palestinian leadership will realize that they too should come along in some matter. I doubt, by the way, that this will happen because they had so many opportunities. They really simply don't know how to say yes. And it's harmed them. Of course, by the way, it hasn't harmed their leadership, which is living high off the hog, as we say. Made a lot of money, and they travel around the world, and they live quite well, and they don't give a darn about the Palestinian people. This Israel UAE is extremely important, this deal. As I said, this is the third peace agreement to be signed between Israel and an Arab country. And this agreement will increase the prospects for peace, stability, and prosperity in the Middle East. Apparently, Israel and several Gulf states have been closely collaborating under the table for a number of years, mainly on security issues. These relations are now being opened up and upgraded. More and more people across much of the Sunni Muslim Arab world no longer perceive Israel as an enemy, but rather as a potential ally. And this deal will increase Israel's legitimacy as a Jewish state in the Middle East. Keep in mind, I said this before, a lot of people are not familiar with the conflicts within the Muslim world. There are Sunni Muslims and there are Shiite Muslims, and they don't really care much for each other. And Iran is a Shiite Muslim state. Most of the other states, including, for example, Saudi Arabia, these are Sunnis. And they fear, for example, a nuclear-armed Iran. So I guess you can say that a combination of threats and opportunities made this agreement happen. The threat both countries face is Iran's quest for domination in the Middle East via violence and via terrorism and military interventions and nuclear weapons. Iran is active in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. The Arab Gulf states are especially vulnerable to the Iranian threat. The Israel-UAE agreement is expected to deal more effectively with Iran. Other Gulf states like Bahrain and Oman are likely and hopefully sign similar agreements with Israel as they share the same concerns that brought about the agreement with the UAE. In addition to the matter of a common threat, opportunities exist in the fields of technology and trade. Israel is the startup nation. Israel leads the world in innovation, advanced technologies, and artificial intelligence in the fields of medicine, agriculture, solar energy, water conservation, and desalination, all important to the Gulf states. These are all things that they're interested in and are meaningful to them. Now, one of the problems we're having, it's a real serious issue, is that this Israel-UAE agreement halted Israel's plan to unilaterally apply sovereignty to areas in Judea and Samaria, like the Jordan Valley. These are areas that the Trump peace plan had allocated to Israel, and the American Secretary of State, even about a month ago, said Israel can go ahead. Meanwhile, the president's son-in-law, Jared, says they shouldn't go ahead. But at any rate, whether we go ahead or not, it sends the Palestinians several clear messages, and I'll touch upon them after the break.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Bentako, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany's but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom! I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. Before the break, I was saying that the Israel-UAE agreement stopped Israel's plan to unilaterally apply sovereignty to areas like the Jordan Valley, which the Trump peace plan had allocated to Israel. And that's a subject unto itself, and there's a lot of resistance from the settler movement, which is a subject unto itself. I don't want to discuss today. I want to wait to see how it plays itself out. But in the meantime, this agreement with an Arab country sends the Palestinians 4 clear messages. First, the Palestinians can no longer exercise veto power on relations between Israel and Arab states, because Israel shares significant security and economic interests with those states, and those states are more interested in these relationships than they are interested in the plight of the Palestinian Arabs. Also, the second point, containing the Iranian threat, the Shiite Muslim threat, is more important to many Arab Sunni states than the Palestinian cause. They've been playing lip service to the Palestinian cause for years, but now that their own security is in trouble, they drop this facade. Also, time is not on the Palestinian side. For decades, the Palestinians have rejected American proposals, including the most recent one proposed by Trump, on the assumption that eventually Israel will be forced to accept their uncompromising demands, which would be supported by other Arab countries. This premise can no longer be taken for granted at all. And also, the agreement undermines the Palestinian strategy of conditioning peace agreements between Israel and Arab countries on an agreement between the Palestinians and Israel. The other Arab countries are more worried about their own security and their own prosperity than they are, and are no longer be interested in paying lip service to the Palestinian cause. The Israeli-UAE agreement really exposes the enemies of peace and stability in this region. Iran and Turkey, the two big non-Arab Muslim theocracies, have not only condemned the agreement, but they've threatened the UAE and promised retaliation. Their purpose is to deter other Arab countries from following this example. Recently, Turkey threatened Greece over gas reserves and maritime rights in the eastern Mediterranean. The truth of the matter is about time that the United States and NATO define Turkey as a hostile power undermining Western interests in this region. This agreement also sends a message to the European Union, especially to the Western member states that still subscribe to obsolete beliefs about the Middle East. Despite the so-called Arab Spring and the civil wars going on in Syria, Yemen, and Libya, the EU still mistakenly refers to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as the Middle East conflict, and the EU views peace between Israel and the Palestinians as the key to stability in the entire region, which it absolutely is not. Like the Palestinians, the European Union continues to claim that Arab-Israeli peace can only come after an Israeli-Palestinian peace. And according to the EU, first Israel has to make peace with the Palestinians, and then they can make peace with other Arab nations. And that is simply not true, and this latest agreement proves it. Also, the agreement destroys the myth that a right-wing Israeli government can't make peace with the Arabs. This is a long-time myth. It was proven false as long ago as 1979, when the first peace agreement was negotiated by a right-wing government led by Menachem Begin and Egypt's Anwar Sadat. Similarly, a right-wing Israeli government negotiated this latest agreement. There was some strange background to this agreement I don't want to go into now. It really has to do with internal Israeli politics. It seems that our prime minister went ahead and made the agreement, a really historical agreement, without telling his partners in the coalition. That's a story unto itself. Maybe I'll have a chance to say more about that. Trump would like to have a public celebration in honor of this historic agreement like those on the White House lawn that marked the signing of the peace agreement with Egypt in 1979 and the Oslo Accords in 1993, as well as the one held on the border between Israel and Jordan to celebrate the 1994 peace agreement. However, Trump's deal of the century hasn't worked out too well, but this latest agreement, Israel-UAE, is certainly cause for celebration. There is a good possibility, by the way, this is an election year. The Democratic Convention is taking place, or sort of virtually taking place this week in Minneapolis, and certainly Trump is hoping a breakthrough will help win the 2020 presidential election. I'm sure it'll help him with the evangelical vote. It won't help him with the Jewish vote in the United States, because historically the Jewish vote is over 80% Democratic, no matter what the Democrats do. And by the way, I see this in my own family. I have relatives in the United States, and you can't even talk to them about Trump. The very mention of Trump makes them froth at the mouth. I don't know why, but that's the way it is. So, while the deal is indeed a major achievement, it won't significantly affect the vote, because American voters are focused on the pandemic, the economy, And there's very little likelihood they'll place much importance on this agreement. Interestingly enough, if you look historically, Jimmy Carter helped reach peace between Israel and Egypt in 1979, but he lost the 1980 election because of bad economic conditions in the United States. So even though he was a big international peacemaker, it didn't help him when the economy was bad. But also, George H.W. Bush got Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, but he lost the next presidential election due to worsening economic conditions. So Americans vote their pocketbook, pretty much. Now, timing could be a factor in America. The selection of Kamala Harris as the Democratic vice president candidate is apparently a big plus for Biden, and it strengthens his candidacy, although he himself looks, to me at least, kind of weak. The Israel-UAE agreement could somehow offset the negative repercussions. Israel and the Gulf states are worried to death about Biden and the Democrats because of their intention to restore the nuclear deal with Iran negotiated by Barack Obama. A nuclear Iran is something that scares the daylights out of the Gulf states. And the Democrats repeating that they'll renew the nuclear deal is really frightening to them. It's an existential problem. The Israel-UAE agreement could be a message to Biden and the Democrats that they would do well to give more weight to the interests of American allies in the region, and should certainly not legitimize an untrustworthy Iran's imperial ambitions. These are the facts on the ground. So this agreement with the UAE is a historic one. There's still a lot of problems, which I alluded to, internal problems here in Israel, because our prime minister made this great deal without bothering to inform his coalition neighbors, if you will. And it really is a tremendous insult to the Blue and White Party, because, among other things, one of the members of Blue and White is the alternative prime minister, and another one is the foreign minister. And when you go make a deal of this magnitude without bothering to tell the foreign minister, you're really stepping on toes and you're asking for trouble. So this might have a very, very strong influence on the domestic scene here, because why Bibi did this is something I have to read more about and see what it really means. At any rate, it's been a historic week, and it's an exciting time. There never seems to be a dull moment here in the Middle East, and in general, one doesn't know what the future will bring, but here in the Middle East, it really can be surprising. So until next time, then, this is Jay Shapiro signing off. Let's hope we all have a good week.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.